lead up to the big day, Benjamin Netanyahu targeted minorities and non-voters in a charm offensive. He also led a relentless smear campaign against his main political challenger, former military chief Benny Gantz. And it looks like his effort has paid off.
It's a win against all odds because we stood up against powerful forces. They had already eulogized us. Our enemies said the Netanyahu era is over, but we turned the plate on its head. We turned the lemons to lemonade.
Netanyahu's Likud Party is set to gain 4 seats in parliament, taking its total to 36. This is the closest he's been to a record 5th term in office. But Likud and its allies still don't have the numbers for a parliament majority in the 120-seat Knesset.
I think that he won the trust of the people, of the majority of the people, although some people would reject the idea. It's ambivalent.
If Netanyahu is able to break what's been a year-long political deadlock, he faces big challenges to bring the economy up to speed. While unemployment is at a record low and wages are rising, economic growth is expected to slow to 2.9% this year. That's down from 3.5% in 2019. The country's budget deficit is expected to further widen this year, after growing to nearly 4% of GDP in 2019. And the coronavirus, which has already cost Israel around $290 million, is expected to put even more pressure on the economy. With the ongoing political stalemate, the government had been effectively operating with an austerity budget. Unable to formulate a 2020 spending plan, expenditure has been happening on a month-to-month basis.
Israel needs healing right now. We need unity, reconciliation, and we long for leadership.
Netanyahu's rival Benny Gantz told his supporters that despite the election outcome, his blue and white coalition will continue to serve the people.
I'm an optimistic, since it seems like Netanyahu cannot create a government by himself. In the end of the day, he will have to cooperate with blue and white, and I think this is a good solution for the situation. Nobody wants 4th elections, and I think we can make it for the good.
Forming a government isn't Likud Party's only concern. Netanyahu faces a corruption trial later this month that will be harder for him to fight if he isn't re-elected. But he's in a strong position. Resolution is looking more likely, and that will mean an end to the budget paralysis that has weighed so heavily on the country's economic growth. Reagan Des Vignes, TRT World.
Well, for more on the story, Neri Zilber joins us now from Tel Aviv. He's an adjunct fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a senior fellow at the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre. Welcome to Money Talks, Neri. Now, Netanyahu has called this the biggest victory of his life so far. Why do you think he managed to really come back from defeat in terms of the last election and win more support this time round?
Well, that's a great question. I think he ran a quite effective campaign, at times a very ruthless campaign against his chief rival, Benny Gantz of the Blue and White Party. And Netanyahu used the office of Prime Minister very effectively. Over the past month and a half, he flew to Washington and met with Donald Trump for the release of the quote-unquote deal of the century. He flew to Moscow shortly thereafter. He flew to Africa. And he was very effective at setting the agenda almost on a daily basis and forcing his rival Benny Gantz to play defense and to respond. And on the other side, Benny Gantz and Blue and White, there's no other way to say it. They ran a very lackluster campaign against Netanyahu, despite the fact that, as you mentioned, Netanyahu is facing a slew of corruption indictments and will be in court in about 2 weeks.
That's right. Let's talk about those corruption charges, because it's still unclear in terms of Israeli law whether a leader who is facing corruption charges or criminal charges can actually form a government. Do you think that might be an obstacle in terms of Netanyahu leading the country once again?
That's right. So legally, we're in uncharted territory because Israel has never actually had an incumbent face criminal indictments like this. The Supreme Court will have to decide, perhaps as early as next week, whether Netanyahu is even eligible to be tasked with forming a government. Now, before last night's results, that was still an open question. I'm quite skeptical there's a judge alive who will disqualify Netanyahu after his party, the Likud, won a number of seats more than the rivals, and Netanyahu himself being so close to forming a government. If they were to disqualify him, Israel could be in the middle of a constitutional crisis.
Tell us more about the Israeli economy. It's still one of the stronger economies in the region, but it is facing some problems, isn't it? What state is Israel's economy in right now, and what is Netanyahu promising to do?
Well, look, the macro indicators are quite strong, despite the year of political deadlock here. Foreign investment is still flowing in. There is a capital surplus. So the economy itself is quite robust. Unemployment is quite low. Having said that, as your correspondent mentioned, they're on a monthly budget basis. The budget deficit is growing. No matter who would be prime minister after yesterday's results, they would likely have to raise taxes. Nobody quite said that on the campaign trail, obviously, but that's a likely reality. And then, obviously, moving forward, the implications of certain policies could have an impact economically. There is a lot of investment that was promised on the campaign trail in terms of education, infrastructure, and health. That will cost money. A lot of promises were made to various demographic and sectoral groups, primarily the settlers in the West Bank. That might have to cost the country a lot of money. And then in terms of the implications on the ground, if Netanyahu were to move forward with annexation of Israeli settlements in the West Bank like he promised repeatedly on the campaign trail, that could in turn draw a severe reaction from the Palestinians, further perhaps destabilizing the region.
Okay, Neri Zilber in Tel Aviv, thank you so much again for your analysis.